The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, spanning from September 26 to November 11, 1918, stands as the largest and deadliest operation in American military history. This pivotal campaign was instrumental in bringing World War I to a close. By mid-1918, the German army was on the defensive. The failure of the Spring Offensive had drained their manpower and resources, and the momentum of the war had shifted toward the Allies. With fresh American troops arriving in Europe in ever-increasing numbers, the balance of power had changed. The Allies, recognizing the opportunity to deliver a final blow, launched the 100 Days Offensive, a series of coordinated attacks designed to break the German front and force an armistice. The Meuse-Argonne sector was chosen as the American sector of this offensive. This region in northeastern France was no ordinary battlefield. It was one of the most heavily fortified areas along the Western Front, part of the Hindenburg Line, the backbone of Germany's defensive strategy. Stretching between the Meuse River and the Argonne Forest, the terrain was rugged, covered with thick woodlands, rolling hills, and narrow ravines, ideal for defenders. The Germans had spent years turning it into an impregnable stronghold, constructing trench systems, machine gun nests, and reinforced bunkers. Their artillery was well placed on high ground, and their defensive positions were supported by extensive barbed wire and hidden pillboxes. The strategic objective was clear: break through the German defenses, reach the Sedan-Mézières railway, and sever one of the main supply lines that kept the German war effort alive. If the Americans could capture this crucial transportation hub, German forces along the front would be cut off from essential reinforcements and supplies. The success of this offensive could make a German retreat inevitable. Commanding this massive undertaking was General John J. Pershing, leader of the American Expeditionary Forces, AEF. Unlike the European generals who had spent years waging trench warfare, Pershing believed in aggressive, offensive tactics. He had resisted attempts to integrate American troops into British and French formations, insisting that the U.S. fight as an independent force. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive would be the ultimate test of that decision. The U.S. Army had never attempted an operation on this scale before. Over 600,000 American troops would take part in the attack, the largest single offensive in U.S. military history. But the Americans faced serious challenges. Many of their soldiers were inexperienced, fresh from training camps in the U.S., and had never seen combat. Logistical issues plagued the AEF. Moving vast amounts of artillery, ammunition, and supplies through the congested roads behind the front was a daunting task. Communication between units was unreliable, and Pershing's belief in relentless offensive action meant his forces would be attacking some of the most formidable German defenses of the war. Despite these challenges, the orders were given. The American forces were to advance across a 24-mile front, pushing through multiple layers of German defenses and securing key positions before the enemy could regroup. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive would not just be a battle of firepower. It would be a test of endurance, coordination, and sheer willpower. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive required one of the most complex logistical operations of World War I. Over 600,000 American troops, supported by French divisions, had to be moved into position without alerting the Germans. The scale of the buildup was unprecedented for the American Expeditionary Forces. Entire divisions had to be rotated into the front lines, and thousands of tons of supplies, artillery shells, rations, medical equipment, had to be transported along congested roads under the cover of night. To maintain secrecy, movements were conducted in darkness, and strict orders were given to minimize noise. The terrain itself posed a formidable challenge. The Argonne forest was dense, with thick underbrush and steep ravines that would restrict visibility and movement. The Meuse River and the surrounding marshes made the eastern flank difficult to traverse. But the most significant obstacle was the Hindenburg Line, the German defensive network designed to withstand prolonged assaults. This system of trenches, barbed wire, machine gun nests, and fortified positions had been reinforced over the past 4 years. The Germans had constructed concrete bunkers, hidden artillery positions, and strong points along high ground, giving them commanding fields of fire. The Americans also had to contend with the tactical realities of modern warfare. Many of their troops were inexperienced, fresh recruits who had never faced battle before. The AEF had fought well in smaller engagements, but this would be their first large-scale, sustained offensive against a deeply entrenched enemy. Coordination between infantry, artillery, and air support had to be precise, but many divisions lacked the experience to execute such complex maneuvers. Communication lines were unreliable, often disrupted by artillery fire, and aerial reconnaissance was limited by poor weather conditions. Pershing's strategy was simple but aggressive. Overwhelm the enemy with a massive barrage of over 2,700 artillery pieces, then advance in force across a 24-mile front. The infantry would be supported by tanks, machine gun units, and the newly formed U.S. Air Service, which would provide reconnaissance and strafing runs on German positions. Yet, despite careful planning, problems arose before the first shot was fired. The roads leading to the front were in horrendous condition, clogged with endless convoys of supply trucks, ambulances, and artillery carriages. Delays slowed the troop buildup, forcing last-minute adjustments. The rain turned the ground into mud, making movement even more difficult. By the time the offensive was set to begin, exhaustion had already set in among many of the soldiers. On September 26, 1918, in the hours before dawn, American forces stood ready. The largest artillery bombardment in U.S. history was about to begin. What lay ahead was an offensive that would push the American forces to their absolute limits. At 5:30 a.m. on September 26, 1918, the stillness of the Argonne region was shattered by the largest artillery barrage in American history. Over 2,700 guns roared to life, unleashing a relentless bombardment on the German positions. For 3 hours, shells rained down, targeting machine gun nests, trenches, and supply routes. The barrage was designed to destroy enemy fortifications and disrupt communications before the infantry assault began. The Germans, caught in their dugouts, suffered heavy casualties, but their defenses were far from broken. As the bombardment ceased, 600,000 American troops, alongside French forces, surged forward across a 24-mile front. Their objective: breach the German defensive lines and push toward the Meuse River. The first wave moved through the early morning fog, advancing cautiously over a battlefield littered with craters and debris. In the center of the attack, the 79th Division was tasked with capturing Montfaucon, a heavily fortified German observation post that overlooked the entire sector. To the east, the 37th and 91st Divisions advanced toward the Meuse, while on the left flank, the 77th Division entered the dense Argonne forest. The initial assault met with mixed success. In some areas, American forces advanced several miles, catching German defenders off guard. But in others, progress was slow. The Germans had survived the bombardment in deep, reinforced bunkers, emerging as soon as the shelling stopped. Machine gun fire swept across the battlefield, cutting down advancing troops. German artillery, positioned on the high ground, began responding with devastating accuracy, turning entire sections of the American advance into chaos. Montfaucon, a key objective, proved especially difficult. The 79th Division, composed largely of inexperienced troops, struggled to coordinate its assault. The Germans, well entrenched, rained machine gun and artillery fire onto the advancing Americans, slowing their progress to a crawl. It took nearly 2 days of fierce combat before Montfaucon was finally secured. In the Argonne forest, the battle took on a different nature. Dense foliage and uneven terrain made maneuvering nearly impossible. Communication between units broke down. Machine gun nests, hidden within the underbrush, turned the forest into a killing ground. American troops had to clear each German strongpoint by hand, engaging in brutal, close-quarters combat with rifles, bayonets, and grenades. The 77th Division, tasked with advancing through the forest, found itself cut off from reinforcements, facing some of the most intense fighting of the entire offensive. Despite these obstacles, the offensive pressed forward. Pershing's strategy demanded constant pressure, no matter the cost. Inexperienced American divisions, many of whom had never seen combat before, were learning the harsh realities of modern warfare in real time. German resistance was fierce, but cracks were beginning to form. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was underway, and the battle was only beginning. As the offensive pressed on, the battlefield became a grinding test of endurance. The initial gains of September 26th had given way to brutal, methodical combat. The Germans, now fully aware of the scale of the American assault, reinforced their positions and launched counterattacks. The terrain, already difficult, became a killing ground. The Argonne forest, thick with underbrush and ravines, concealed German machine gun nests that could only be eliminated through direct assault. The Meuse Valley, lined with artillery positions, allowed German gunners to rain down shells with deadly accuracy. Every advance was met with stiff resistance. By early October, the offensive slowed to a brutal stalemate. The Kriemhilde Stellung, the final and most heavily fortified sector of the Hindenburg Line, stood in the Americans' path. Here, the Germans had created a near-impenetrable defensive network, trenches reinforced with concrete bunkers, artillery positions buried into hillsides, and interlocking machine gun nests that covered every approach. American forces, many still inexperienced in prolonged assaults, were thrown against these fortifications with little opportunity to maneuver. The rain turned the battlefield into a sea of mud, bogging down artillery and supply convoys. Ammunition shortages became critical, with frontline troops often advancing beyond their logistics support. Communication lines were frequently cut by enemy shelling, forcing units to rely on runners to relay orders, a delay that left commanders struggling to coordinate attacks. As casualties mounted, entire divisions were rotated out and replaced by fresh troops, but even these reinforcements quickly found themselves exhausted by the relentless pace of combat. In the Argonne Forest, the 77th Division found itself in one of the most desperate fights of the offensive. Pushing forward through near-impenetrable terrain, a unit of 554 men under Major Charles Whittlesey advanced too far ahead of the main force. By October 2nd, they were completely surrounded. For 6 days, they endured constant shelling, sniper fire, and dwindling rations. Attempts to resupply them by air were largely ineffective, and when American artillery mistakenly bombarded their position, their fate seemed sealed. Only through sheer determination, and a final message carried by a wounded carrier pigeon named Cher Ami, was their location relayed to headquarters. When relief forces finally arrived, only 194 men remained standing. Elsewhere, individual acts of heroism defined the offensive. On October 8th, Sergeant Alvin York of the 82nd Division found himself at the center of an attack against a heavily defended German position. As his unit was pinned down by machine gun fire, York, armed with a rifle and pistol, single-handedly eliminated an entire German machine gun nest before capturing 132 enemy soldiers. His actions, later awarded the Medal of Honor, became one of the most famous stories of the war. The relentless nature of the Meuse-Argonne Offensive took its toll on both sides. The Germans, recognizing that their defensive line was crumbling, fought with increasing desperation. But the Americans, despite exhaustion, logistical failures, and high casualties, continued their advance. The fighting had now entered its most critical phase, one that would determine whether the offensive would break through or grind to a halt in the face of unyielding resistance. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was not just a test of strategy and firepower. It was a battle defined by acts of resilience, heroism, and endurance in the face of near-impossible odds. Across the battlefield, individual soldiers and entire units found themselves caught in desperate situations, forced to rely on their training, instincts, and sheer determination to survive. Beyond these legendary encounters, thousands of lesser-known acts of bravery unfolded across the battlefield. Medics worked tirelessly under enemy fire, dragging wounded soldiers from the killing zones. Engineers repaired broken supply lines under constant bombardment. Machine gun crews continued firing despite being outnumbered and encircled. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was not won through a single decisive action, but through the cumulative resolve of countless men who pressed forward despite the exhaustion, the losses, and the overwhelming violence that defined every inch of the battlefield. Hi there, I'm Kyle, the host of History of Human Evolution, with a PhD in history and a love for storytelling. I'm here to guide you through the fascinating journey of our species. If you like to explore the past, hit that subscribe button, like this video, and share your thoughts below.